Hard work pays off. Dreams come true. Bad times don't last, but bad guys do. He was the bad guy, but he was perfectly good at it, winning multiple Intercontinental Championships, like in Madison Square Garden at WrestleMania 10 in a classic ladder match against the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, only to supersede it, in my personal opinion, at SummerSlam 1995 in a tremendous ladder match. One of the forgotten ladder matches. Why don't more people talk about SummerSlam 1995? Oh yeah, Mabel and Diesel. We're here to talk about the bad guy. We are here to talk about the man that oozed machismo, that would carve you up, that left a hell of a legacy. And sure, there were many times where Razor Ramon or the real-life Scott Hall would feel low, but he could get everybody in the palm of his hand with two simple words: hey, yo. I'm John Renton with my review of WWE on A&E Biography, WWE Legends on Scott Hall, Razor Ramon. Whatever name you wanted to give him. I mean, honestly, the man just oozed machismo, and that wasn't just a catchphrase. The man literally felt cool, seemed cool. He was cooler than cool. I mean, honestly, Scott Hall was fucking tremendous. I do have a question before I really dive into things, because things really are about to get super emotional because of some of the subject matter. Do you think that Scott Hall is the greatest wrestler to never win a recognized world championship? Answers in the comments, please. Bear in mind that since most people usually say Kurt Hennig, he won the AWA title. And if you don't think the AWA World Heavyweight Championship is a recognized world title, that means that Vern Gagne, Nick Bockwinkel, Rick Martel, and Stan Hansen aren't recognized world champions. And I don't think that's right. That being said, this was tough. This was really goddamn tough. It was nice that a lot more of the footage that they shot around the time of the Hall of Fame was used here, and it was from 2014 when he was in better spirits, and boy, the stuff with the family was tough. This was really fucking tough. I mean, a lot of the stuff with his wrestling career, vast majority of fans knew from shoot interviews, watching, depending on, your particular age. If you're like me, and I know I'm like me, if I wasn't like me, who the fuck would I be? If you're around, in your late 30s, early 40s, you likely do remember Scott Hall pretty well. And it was kind of cool to see some of the territorial stuff, but let's just jump into it. And I do want to say also, I'm going to get the substance abuse hotline in the description, because so much of the subject of this was about substance abuse and overlaying, just feeling of dread because of one particular life-changing incident that Scott just could not get past. And you understand why. Jesus. We go to St. Counties, Maryland. Steve Hall, Scott's brother, he's a sheriff there. He starts things off a little bit. They record, apparently in 2014, they recorded about 6 hours of footage over 2 days, and they use a lot more of it. We'd seen some of these clips either around the Hall of Fame or in other documentaries shortly after. Young life as an army brat, discovering wrestling at 8 years old, and became so sweet. Dusty probably saw a lot in Scott Hall. You can kind of see why. Their life is like a movie, is what he felt. The dad was a big shot in the army, but he also drank. This is something that unfortunately would follow Scott. The parents got divorced. It was tough on Scott during his formative years. He moved to Orlando along with a friend of his. He was just hopping from place to place. He started weightlifting. He was getting bigger. He went to championship wrestling from Florida shows. He actually got a job so he could attend more of the shows. Then he did bouncer work. And the fateful night, January 15, 1983, he was dating somebody, either a stripper, a dancer, a stripper, or a refinisher. I don't really know. Some girl that worked at this particular establishment. And let's just say things did not end all that well. He ended up in a scuffle with a guy, and there was a gun involved. The gun went off, and he did not mean to kill him. It happened, and it was something that haunted him because it was very graphic. The guy basically had his brains blown out. It was very, very graphic, very tough, and it affected Scott. He should have gotten therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, but he didn't. He spent 8 years with that girl, I guess, kinda. I don't think he was with the girl for a full-on 8 years, because he was married to another woman, his ex-wife, Dana, in like February of 1990, so it wouldn't quite match up, but let's just say he was with the girl for a bit. He moved to Tampa, and wrestling had changed. It was more about looks, I did like the old archival footage they used. His time in championship wrestling from Florida. Unfortunately, Eddie Graham had taken his own life, so that by that point, even though they tried to run Florida, it didn't work out all that well. Blackjack Lanza saw some potential in him and got Scott to the AWA. You could see why. I mean, Jack Lanza, look at pictures of Jack Lanza, read up on him. I mean, he was a tall son of a bitch and could see big things for Big Scott Hall. That was actually something that he was called. I do know that he was American Coyote or Starship for a brief time in Crockett. I know it didn't last long. I think it was him and Dan Spivey, if I recall correctly. The Tom Selleck stash. He met HBK and, well, Shawn Michaels at the time. He wasn't a Heartbreak Kid, but Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty in the AWA. And then Scott, he had everything you need to succeed. Physical charisma. He was very good in the ring. He could time shit great. He could sell well. He was a big, powerful guy. And then we get to more AWA stuff. He is on tour in Germany and sees WWF television, I guess because he just had televisions just playing in any department store, facing out the window like it's goddamn 50s. And he sees that and he's like, I want to be there one day. Well, his now ex-wife, because I think they were married for like 8 years. They got remarried and then finally divorced for good, I think in 2001 or somewhere around that. They got married in February of 1990. Scott loved wrestling, but he wasn't sure if he was going to succeed, so he was thinking about leaving it. He was on a tour in Europe, and his wife was pregnant, and he called DDP because I think they had associated a little bit in the AWA, if I recall correctly, or at least had interacted. And because DDP was a manager in the AWA, and he basically got Scott a job in 1991. And now DDP was a manager, and then he would leave and come back in 1994. And by that point, Scott was in the WWF. But Sean Waltman, great in these. A lot of great talking heads, and Bruce Pritchard. They didn't have Jake Snake Roberts for this, which kind of makes sense because everybody's battles with addiction are different. I do want to say once again, if you are battling any form of addiction, help is out there. Look, if we interact on here, you can find me on Twitter. Talk to me. All I'm going to tell you is not to do it, but I'm going to give you at least some inspiration. Sometimes people just need, an ear to, listen to them. Be very uncomfortable unless that ear is attached to somebody. Let's get back to this. The George Michael inspiration for the Diamond Stud, which didn't go much of anywhere. I think he debuted as Super Brawl right around the time that Kevin Nash came back as Oz. Oh, that was fun. And they developed a lifelong friendship, driving on the road. And it makes sense why Scott's death affected Kevin Nash so much. He says, I spent more time with Nash or with Hall than I have anybody, in my life. Pritchard talking about, coming up, discussing bringing in Scott Hall. Yeah, of course you were, Bruce. Of course you were. And Vince wanted him to be a soldier, a Buffalo Soldier. And no, it was like a G.I. Joe type of Scott Hall pitched the idea of Scarface. Vince had never seen it. He had never given in to vices. Vince, apparently, according to this, was a clean-cut individual. Of course he wasn't. Vince wasn't in this and probably will not be in any more of these documentaries going forward. But then the tryout footage and the vignettes and, him just basically ripping off Scarface. But it worked because he made it his own, because he was cool. Also, Scarface, if I ever retro-review that, I'm going to have to really take breaks because that is a 3-hour movie nearly. Speaking of breaks, I had to take several breaks during this because it was emotionally tough. I'm going to carve you up. Vince loved the gimmick, really dived into it. And I do recall seeing his debut. I believe it was on Superstars, if I remember right. Superstars or Primetime Wrestling. I think it was Superstars. And he beat a guy, and I'm just like, who is this guy? Because at the time, you got to remember, unless you caught the AWA, on, ESPN, you weren't going to be able to see Scott Hall. And WCW, I'd seen, I thought, I didn't put two and two together at the time because I was 10 years old when, the Diamond Stud debuted, but I'm like, he looks familiar. And then I realized years later, oh shit, the Diamond Stud. No wonder that didn't go over. So, Hogan, Miz, Bischoff chimed in, DDP chimed in. DDP was good here because he was friends with him. Took off as IC champion, the merch, the popularity. I mean, you could argue Scott Hall was pretty much just below Nash as far as a guy that you could really invest in. I mean, and only because Nash was a little bit taller. That's it, even though Scott was like 6'6", 6'7". So, you know, he goes not undefeated. I mean, because he lost to Bret Hart at the 93 Rumble, but he beat Bob Backlund at WrestleMania 9. Hooray, WrestleMania 9. But then on the May 17th, 1993 episode of Raw, the same Raw, where Mario Jannetty beat Shawn Michaels for the Intercontinental Championship with no interference, no one throwing in the towel. Why would anyone think that, Mr. Perfect? But Mario Jannetty won. But on that same show, you had the Lightning Kid, a.k.a. Sean Waltman. He'd been various things. I forget actually what they used him as in WWE, but he was just a guy getting beat up. And Scott saw something in him. And then did the thing where he just beat him up and then hit his head on the post, and stumbled back, and Kid hit that moonsault. 1, 2, 3. Scott sold it like it was the worst thing that ever happened to him. Like Waltman took a shit on his chest and smeared him. He just treated him like a dog. And from there, the 1, 2, 3 Kid was born, and then they would become friends. And then they would become rivals. And we get to the Crybaby match. But he gave the IC title more credibility after, let's be perfectly honest, even though the IC title had plenty of credibility because of Bret and Shawn had a decent run, Scott Hall as IC champion worked. It fucking worked. He was champion in, I believe, October 93 when Shawn got, suspended and didn't want to give the title back. So he's just like, no, I'm going to keep it here. And then he quit the company, but then they wouldn't let him out of his contract. Allegedly, reportedly, covering my ass here. And then they had the Mania 10 ladder match, which is great. His son Cody chimes in. Cody tried wrestling. It didn't work. You can kind of see why. But he gave a ton to a lot of wrestlers. He gave a ton. He was willing to sell, willing to do stuff. Nobody kicked out of the Razor's Edge, which is great stuff. The Mania 10 ladder match, again, I argue the SummerSlam 95 match is better, but arguably, Mania 10 is more remembered because it's Mania, Madison Square Garden, there you are. But, great stuff. And then the Click. Hey, remember that Bam Bam Bigelow and Chris Candido and various other people weren't really very happy with the Click? You kind of see why? Yeah, they worked with each other and they dominated some of the titles and they dominated quite a bit of the TV time. They also were very popular, but that's another story for another day. I'm going to talk about the positives of Scott Hall. His vices do take over, though, and they wouldn't let go. It's like the Gary Hart thing where he talked about Gino and he couldn't chase the demons away. And unfortunately, those demons dominated him. I mean, those demons ruined his first, relationship, or his the big relationship before he married Dana, and they were really taking hold at this point. Cassidy, his daughter, I felt so fucking bad for her. My God, I felt so bad for her. Because during a lot of her childhood and formative years, she loves her dad. You can tell through all the trials and tribulations, because I don't think he ever treated his kids bad. He was just in a bad state because of just this deal that this ordeal that he went through in January of 83. He was fed up with not getting as much pay as he wanted. Even though he was getting good pay, he was always on the road. He gave his notice. DDP put him in contact with Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff gave him a sweetheart deal. You people, you know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here. $1.2 million a year for 120 to 150 dates a year. Pretty goddamn good. And Nash, I believe, got even more. So, yeah, $1.2 million a year, or at least thereabouts. I mean, maybe it wasn't quite $1.2 million. I mean, I don't know. I didn't see WCW's books, but obviously they wanted to pay up to you-know-what, and Ted Turner's like, yeah, I don't care. I lost more money on the Braves, and I'll ever lose on wrestling, as Terry Taylor once said, that stooge. But Madison Square Garden curtain call, that kind of got glossed over. And Peter Rosenberg said one thing that was absolutely stupid. Huge WWE stars going to WCW was still novel when Scott went. Hogan, Savage, Jim Duggan. You can laugh about Jim Duggan if you want, you dicks. But Jim Duggan was actually a pretty big star. Now, did he mean something in WCW by 96? I mean, who knows? But he got paid, and he's a double cancer survivor. He has beaten that twice. Ho! But no, in all seriousness, Hogan and Savage, I guess, mean nothing, according to Rosenberg. Idiot. So, and I'm not going to go, and the Nasty Boys even went there, and sure, you could laugh about the Nasty Boys. Now, they were a pretty big deal for a few years. Did they move the needle? Maybe not. They were still big acts. Bulldog also went over there in 93. Didn't quite work out. NWO formation, things take off, but unfortunately his vices just would not let go. He could see his family more often, but unfortunately, vices, he would get into cocaine. There was a drunk angle that they did on Nitro, which I hated. I fucking hated that shit. WCW put him in rehab. Waltman even talked about picking him up from rehab. And that, went to the liquor store and he'd look great because he detoxed and he was looking great. And then he went to the liquor store and he was just doing it because he obviously wanted help, but he needed to want help for him. He needed to want to help himself, basically, is the way I can come up with it. And he took Bischoff and I believe a couple others to the Dollhouse, that club, and described in great detail. And Bischoff understood why he was the way he was. I don't think Bischoff's being insensitive, but it's just Hall could just never work past that. His last pay-per-view match was against Sid and Jeff Jarrett at Super Brawl 2000. And then they brought up the contract thing with Goldberg and Nash, I believe, at Bash at the Beach 2000. Because Hall had already left. Hall would do a couple house shows in ECW. He would work some in Japan, even putting over young Tanahashi. And then he would have arrests and DUIs. The NWO and WWE didn't work because things were, I guess, going okay up to Mania 18. But then when he was told he was going to lose to Austin and they were just going to all get beaten into powder, I guess there were certain things that maybe he felt he should be promised, or maybe certain things should go his way, or whatever. Maybe he was just that just put him in a down state when he seemed to be doing better. That's what I've heard from reports, like, friends of his saying, he seemed to be doing better. And then he started drinking more. He was on the plane ride from hell. That got taken care of. I talked about the plane ride from hell episode on Dark Side of the Ring review. You can check that out. They skipped over the NWA TNA stuff because he was, I believe, at their first pay-per-view, if not their first, I think the second one that they did. And then he was part of Victory Road 2004. In the company for a little bit, that didn't last, and then he would have a few stints. The last stint was in 2010 when Hogan and Bischoff took over. No one could help him. There were indie appearances, even with Nash, and then the indie show in 2011. I'm going to say right now, the promoter of that goddamn fiasco, that fucking douchebag, if I ever find out who that guy is, that guy never deserves to run another goddamn show for what he did. Exploiting that goddamn guy. And look, he may have paid Scott Hall quite a bit. You know what? You should have made sure that he was in good shape. Or maybe you should have done your homework and not put somebody else in that state. Because, my God, he had to be dragged to the ring. He couldn't do anything. And then the ESPN special in 2011. The drug rehab stints. Stephanie was even quoted as saying at that time, hey, remember how the towers fell? Well, my family was targeted by the government too. She didn't say that. She didn't say that. Not there. She said that 10 years before. Dumb bitch. But anyway, she's talked about how we spent more money on him than any other talent. And then the Dollhouse shooting, he talks about that. This was really, really hard shit. And then Jeremy Shep, who I totally forgot about. But he, great ESPN reporter, or former ESPN reporter. I actually don't know if he still works there. He was great. He was great here talking about the ESPN special and other stuff and how Scott Hall meant a lot to wrestling. And then he got the stuff with DDP Yoga, got clean, as clean as he could. Hall of Fame induction. Because Waltman even said to DDP, Scott has a gun, he says he's going to do it. I'm choosing my words carefully. And then he got into the Hall of Fame, said that iconic quote. It was moving, very good stuff. And he helped out the talents, would give them advice, but he was still struggling. The last few years of his life are not what I would call a picture of health. The demon still had a hold, the 83 death, and what really hit him was the pandemic. Because then he was isolated in the house, and people couldn't come see him. And even if anybody could come see him, he couldn't. I mean, he could work out the house, he could do a little cardio, but he also needed a new hip. I think he needed surgery for that. And I think he needed to have money raised for a new hip. Maybe it was him and Jake, or maybe it was just Jake. But DDP's biography, by the way, is next week. Then we get to March 2022. And he fell, and he was down for a while before anybody found him. Couldn't get to the phone, couldn't get to anything. He was struggling because he had balance issues, drugs, all that. It just, the fact is all the stuff. Even if he was clean and sober at the time, I mean, I'm not trying to cast disparaging, throw disparaging remarks to him, but he was just struggling, and it finally took hold, and his daughter was coming to help him. Talking about, how he was lucky to have a daughter like her, she was lucky to have a dad like him, or I have the best daughter, I have the best dad, and if that doesn't get you moving, I don't know what will. And then he was going to have surgery, then he had a series of heart attacks, and he died. And then everybody was talking about his legacy, everybody was losing it, because Scott meant a lot to a lot of people, and I will not say he was perfect. I will not say that there weren't things that he said, because he just didn't give a shit. But he still was a hell of a goddamn wrestler, and he meant a lot to his friends, and he was quite the wrestler. He was great on the mic, he was great in the ring when he wanted to be, and it's just, I really wish he had won a world title. I really wish he had won one either in WWE or in WCW, whatever. I mean, he wouldn't have won one in TNA. As cool as it would have been for him to be the NWA TNA champion, don't know how long that would have lasted. But that being said, Scott Hall, what a legacy. What a legacy. And it is true that hard work pays off and dreams come true. And bad times don't last, but bad guys do. Rest in peace, Scott. The substance abuse line will be in the description. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, Twitter handle in the description. I'm John Ritlin. I'll see you soon.